Coming up on the Mind Caddy.
When you can attain that level of unconditional self-respect, unconditional love for yourself, it liberates you from fear, which
Yes.
is what I think as you and I agree, that's the most important part of the mental game is to liberate yourself from fear, right?
There's a misunderstanding between trying to work on your golf swing and actually resting your attention somewhere to perform.
Is you have to experiment to find out how your emotional side of your psyche reacts to a small target versus a big target.
You know, at its base level, can you learn some mental game skills to reduce the perception of threat?
Mind Caddy.
Hello, Jim. You're back on the show again. Thanks for being with us.
Hey, Carl, great to be back. Thanks for having me again. I really look forward to these conversations.
So we get them in the diary, and I look forward to what the topic's going to be about. But you said, I think we need to sort of finish off the tail end of the last one that we did, Jim. You said you had a lot of feedback from clients and new clients about the rite of passage. It seems that struck a deep chord with people who were listening. But you said, you emailed me, you said there was a couple of things that you wanted to tie up the loose ends on that.
Yeah, because I had mentioned in the midst of our conversation on rite of passage that there was a second type other than the more traditional standard type, and then we got off on another topic, so we didn't return to it. And I had some people ask me, "Well, what is the second type?" And ironically, the second type is more widely known in popular culture, and the general term for that type of rite of passage is called vision quest. But it turns out that in traditional tribal societies, only a small minority of tribal members would embark on a vision quest, maybe, less than 10%. And they normally became the tribal elders, the chiefs, the war chiefs especially, or the shamans or the healers, the medicine men and medicine women. So it is very different in a lot of ways than the sort of normal coming of age, age 12 to 16 rite of passage,
Yeah.
which is about learning how to let go of your childhood ego and develop a fully formed adult ego.
Mm.
Yeah.
And what was the vision quest about? Was that creating a vision of what your purpose should be going forward?
Well, you can think of it, yeah, to answer that question, if you think of compare and contrast the two types. So in traditional coming of age rite of passage, you go from childhood ego to adult ego. And in Vision Quest, you go from adult ego most of the time. There were exceptions, but in general, most of the time, you would go from adult ego to have some type of very profound spiritual or mystical experience where your adult ego would sometimes it's referred to as ego dissolution or ego death and rebirth and reintegration. So which is a whole other level of spiritual and psychological transformation.
Mm.
Um, which is why those guys and gals tended to become the leaders of their
Right.
society because they had gone to another level of attaining wisdom.
Mm.
But in the popular culture, and this has been a kind of a thing since the 60s with the psychedelic movement, there's been this idea that you could just be an ordinary sort of someone raised in the West who didn't go through the traditional rite of passage, and you could, go up in the mountains and spend, which I did stuff like this when I was a teenager. You could spend like a month living by yourself in the desert in the mountains and fast a lot, or take a psychedelic drug. The problem with that approach, which we're seeing a resurgence now in popular culture, is it has a terrible track record for producing a positive outcome.
Right.
Because for you to have a powerful mystical experience where you experience an ego death and rebirth, reintegration, if you don't already have a fully formed adult ego, you may not get to the rebirth reintegration part. You can end up being damaged psychologically
Right.
from it. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Which is why I felt like we should talk about that a little bit, because I don't want to give people the impression that's something anybody could just go ahead and do without
No.
any possible negative repercussions.
I think the bit that for me, folks who gave me feedback, Jim, that struck the deepest chord was with golf. If we bring it back to golf, as most people listening are golfers, the idea of being prepared to shoot high numbers and being prepared to hit poor shots and doing that with an openness and willingness to do it. Nobody wants to do it. Nobody enjoys doing it. but
Sure.
actually by being willing to embrace that extreme failure, there is some kind of ego disillusion or ego death, or however you want to call it, from a golfing
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah, at a psychological level, there can be, again, not at the more profound mystical level, because at the mystical level, I mean, it's a very, very powerful experience. But to have your self-image be transformed from someone who's vulnerable and not powerful enough to handle stress or handle failure or handle disappointment, all those things are examples of someone who still has some lingering, so-called inner child or inner
Mm,
toddler,
mm,
right? But when you can let go of that part of your psyche and realize I'm an adult, I don't have to prove my self-worth to the
yeah.
world by how well I hit my golf shots or shooting low scores. I don't need to prove my self-worth
Mm,
to anybody. I already have unconditional respect for myself, even unconditional love for myself. And therefore, when you can attain that level of unconditional self-respect, unconditional love for yourself, it liberates you from fear, which
yes.
is what I think, as you and I agree, that's the most important part of the mental game, is to liberate yourself from fear, right?
Yeah. And I suppose when you look at it, that so much of people's quest searching for golf swings on YouTube or whatever is if you really want to go deep on that, what is driving that desire to try to swing it better and control it is I think is the resistance to what we're talking about. It's the resistance to actually hitting poor shots. Is people's quest for a better golf swing about trying to hit better shots, or is it a deep seated resistance to avoiding poor shots? And I think for an awful
Sure.
lot of us, we've been down that route. We're actually trying to find something that will protect us from the feeling of bad shots.
Yeah, and I think that's true across the board, even from tour pros to high handicaps. There's not everybody, obviously there's exceptions, but probably for 90% of golfers, that's probably driving their quest for improvement more than the mastery aspect
Yeah,
or the enjoyment aspect
yeah,
of hitting good shots. And of course, when you have a mastery mindset, it goes along with the acceptance that failure, it's not even that it's inevitable. It's kind of, you need it. You need to have failure in the early stages of mastering any skill
mm,
to get better, because you learn much more from your mistakes than you do from your successes, don't you think?
yeah. And again, from a brain perspective, there's a different set of chemicals and reactions going on when you're in pursuit of good shots as opposed to avoiding poor shots.
That's right.
A
Yeah.
different movement emerges, and have
Yeah.
we got it so far the wrong way around that there's all this pursuit of trying to swing the golf club better, which ultimately is kind of doomed to failure unless you address some of these ego issues and being willing to actually deal and accept those extreme levels of failure.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And when you have that level of deep acceptance, what that does, I mean, you can talk about it from a neuroscience standpoint, it strengthens the mind/brain to body connection.
Yeah,
So the actual physical skills that are deeply ingrained habitual movement patterns that tend to operate seamlessly and well on the driving range when there's no pressure, they also will operate seamlessly and well on the golf course,
yeah,
where there is, to some degree, some amount of pressure. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. The other thing, we've got a couple of things that we were going to touch on tonight, Jim. Obviously, one of the things that we'd said we'd talk about because of the response the first time was to not conclude the Hogan story. I don't think we'll ever conclude the Hogan story, but if
Sure.
we call it Hogan 2. And one of the notes that you sent me that was, I think, fascinating, because I think it's a real area for potentially people to explore, was your thoughts on, or Hogan's thoughts on grip pressure,
Mhm.
and aiming to keep uniform grip pressure
Yeah.
during the move. Maybe if you could go in some detail on that, and how and where you found out about that and what it potentially means for people.
Yeah. I'll try to remember where I first heard that. It might have been from John Schlee, 'cause I have many, many people who knew and worked with Hogan. I've either talked to or found it in the public record. It might have been Schlee, it might have been Chris Cheddar, who was a longtime student of Hogan, but he was a fanatic on the idea not just constant pressure. That was a separate issue. Well, there was 3 issues, basically. One is having the proper amount of overall pressure, yeah? And in general, most mid to high handicap amateurs, after 35 years of teaching the golf swing, I can tell you that close to 95% grip it way too tightly.
Yeah.
And ironically, some of the lower handicap players I work with, they grip it too lightly, which kind of makes sense in a way. So what I've always taught, which is what Hogan taught you, want for a stock full shot. Now you can vary the pressure to alter trajectory and spin and even curvature to an extent. But for your stock long game shot, you want to have medium pressure. So what I teach on a 1 to 15 scale, if 15 was as tight as you could grip it, you want to be in that sort of 3 to 5 range on your stock full shot. So basically, around 25 to 30% of what your full pressure would be. Yeah. So that's one. And that's even more important if you're going to do a so-called passive wrist cock release instead of assisting the release with wrist and forearm muscles. That has not a great track record for most amateur golfers. It does make the ball go further, but it's difficult to time the release when you have to add muscle activation right before impact. So if you look at the way that most of the female tour pros release it, they just pivot at a constant tempo. So their pivot RPM speed just before, during, and after impact is a constant, right? And they let the flow of energy from their pivot flow into the wrist muscles in the wrist joint to cause the release. They don't
Right.
add extra speed, right?
Yeah.
So it's even more important not to be too tight because if it's too tight, then you'll be late on the release. So that was one, having the proper amount. The second was to have the proper amount of proportional pressure. And Hogan was a big believer, unless you're trying to slice it or hook it, that the grip pressure should be equal.
Oh,
Which brings up an equipment issue, because if you play with traditional grip, traditional meaning in the modern era since 1960, when Golf Pride invented the rubber slip-on grip, which had more taper than the old traditional leather wrap grips. But even today, in the last 10 years or so on tour, because of mainly people like DeChambeau and Bubba Watson, a few others, there's a trend toward removing the bottom half of the grip taper.
Right.
Because if you play with a taper grip, particularly if there's a lot of taper, when it feels like it's equal pressure, you're actually holding on with 25% more pressure in your bottom hand.
right.
Because that bottom hand is 25% narrower than the top hand. So I've been advocating for non-taper grips for 25 years. I
Really?
see immediate improvement in people's ball striking. There are certain grips you can buy standard that come with no taper,
That's
right?
that's so interesting, Jim, that you bring that subject up, because I was talking very same subject with a guy recently. He said we are the only sport that has a tapered grip. If you have
I know, it's
think of
true, isn't it?
tennis
Yeah,
rackets and cricket bats and
yeah.
things like that, it's just a
Hockey
uniform.
sticks, baseball bats, where you're holding it, those things are the same diameter. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right.
yeah. So it would make sense that if it's tapered, you
Yeah.
would have the increased pressure on the lower hand disproportionately.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think Hogan had 100, because it's always hard to tell the available sort of photographic evidence. But I know he knew because he told people about equal pressure, and I know he built them up a little bit. Of course, he played in the era of leather wrap. So whether it was 100% non-tapered or slightly tapered, I can't tell the audience for sure which one, but I know it was way less tapered than a modern rubber slip-on tapered grip for sure.
Mm, mm.
And because, Hogan's, one of his big principles was the idea of the triangle, which is the triangle was the way to create bilateral coordination, meaning equal participation in both sides of the body,
Right.
especially in terms of arm action. He wanted the arm action to be somewhat subdued, not 100%, but close, 90% to the pivot action. And he wanted to have equal participation, in other words, equal tension in both arms, pressing sideways toward each other from the armpits to the fingertips. He called that inward pressure. I like the word sideways pressure.
Oh,
Means the same thing.
oh.
Yeah. And it starts with equal pressure in your hands, meaning you're not going to have equal sideways triangle pressure in your arms if one hand is tighter than the other. So hence the advantage of true non-tapered grips, right?
But also with this, which to me is an interesting subject relating to stuff we've talked a lot about in the past in terms of a focal point. I think a focal point in the swing that's definitely worth exploring with is grip pressure, isn't it? Because it's kind
Oh,
of
for sure.
it's
Yeah,
it's it's far more. So if you pick the grip pressure as a focal point when you swing, it's far more of an observational focal point
that's right.
as opposed to trying to think
Yeah,
about or move in a certain way.
yeah,
You go with that?
100%. I started keeping track. Uh, I started I got the golf bug at age 10. I got it really bad, obviously, made a career out of it, and I still do it today. Every time I meet a good player, a club pro, a teaching pro, a tour pro, or a like a top college player, top amateur, I ask him or her, when you're playing your best, what do you focus your mind on?
Yeah,
And I've got a list in terms of the hierarchy. So no surprise to you, the number one most popular reported focal point is target picture. Number two are two closely related fundamentals, which are tempo and rhythm. And three is grip pressure. So
really,
many people have told me that they use grip pressure for their
really.
not good. Nobody only has one, including Hogan, right? Hogan target was his preference, but he had a few others that he used. So no one says it's always universally X or Y. It's that they always have a variety, but many people have told me that grip pressure was their number one choice, beyond, put it before target picture, for example. Yeah,
And I just think this is so under discussed and so vital for people to find out about a focal point, because I think there's a misunderstanding between trying to work on your golf swing and actually resting your attention somewhere to perform. And what we're talking about is resting your attention somewhere to perform. And
correct.
each individual needs to explore that, doesn't it? And
Yeah,
you know that 1.4, 1.5 seconds that we swing a golf club, where is our attention during that time? And again,
that's
with
right.
coaches as well, I think if we're not exploring that with students as coaches, we're leaving a huge gap, aren't we,
Well,
between
huge.
training and performance?
100%, yeah, because I think the idea of resting, I like that. I also like your old phrase to be an attention detective, be an attention Sherlock Holmes, because it's completely individual. People
Yeah,
sometimes say to me, particularly when I work with someone with yips, "Well, what should I focus my mind?" I go, "I can't tell you that.
yeah, yeah,
You have to do the testing. You have to spend hours on the range and to some extent on practice rounds on the golf course where you're not keeping score, testing
yeah.
what focal points produce results and which don't." For example, I'll often say to people, what might block your yip, a focal point that might block your yip impulse, if I had the yips, which I don't, might trigger my yip impulse.
Yeah.
It could be
Yeah.
completely the opposite effect, right? So
Mm.
you have to do the testing for sure. But I think grip pressure overall has been underrated, underreported. I think it's hugely important. Yeah.
Mm. So from a practical perspective on that, so people can try that out. It's funny you say you use 15. I've used 10 in the past, but it, I mean, you can go either way. So
Yeah.
you would establish first of all what one would be on that scale, which would be almost letting go.
Yeah.
15 would be your veins are
Have
popping
to
out.
be literally as tight as you can squeeze it,
Yeah,
like maximum.
yeah.
And
Wh-
when you test this, you don't wanna do it with a glove on because it inhibits sensation a little bit, so you wanna do it without a glove in your hand.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Tom Watson gave me a tip back in the '70s when I talked to him about this, and he said, without a glove, if you hold a club straight up in the air, particularly one of the heavier clubs like a sand wedge, and make sure your hands don't have any perspiration, and hold it lighter and lighter and lighter. At the moment when it starts to slip down from gravity, right, he would say that would be a 1. And he would say, then go like 25, 30% tighter than that, and that would be the ideal for your stock full shot pressure.
Mm,
It changes a lot though in putting and short game.
yeah.
So for example, in putting, for my advanced players, I teach 3 different grip pressures.
Do you?
One for very long putts, one for medium putts, one for short putts,
Right.
right? Because the shorter the putt, at least my understanding of putting is we miss short putts mostly because we lose control over the face
Face.
angle, not
Yeah.
because of poor distance control.
Yeah.
And what happens when you lose control over the face angle typically is muscles in your fingers, wrists, and forearms are firing that should not be firing.
Yeah.
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 So tighter grip pressure to me equates to short putts, but very light grip pressure. You need light grip pressure for long putts because the issue in a long putt, say outside 40 feet or so, is distance control. You're trying basically not to three putt by having your distance control in the first putt be really good. And when your grip pressure is light, you can feel the weight, the club head weight is more paramount in your awareness with lighter pressure, which
I'm
gives you the distance control automatically, right?
smiling over kindred spirits because when I coach putting, I talk about three distinct categories. So
Mhm.
I'd say 0 to 6 feet would be what I call hole out. 6 feet to 20 feet, I call it opportunity, where you're in that kind of range where you've hit a good shot and you might convert
Yep.
it. And then 20 feet plus would be feel. And
Yeah. I like
I
it. Yeah.
sort of talk about it. It's actually three different sets of skills that you need to develop to be good in those three separate areas. And
That's right.
interesting that you say, 0 to 6 feet. It's not really about green reading at that stage. It's not really about pace. Obviously, these are a factor. It is about primarily face awareness and face control, isn't it? And as you say, that's maybe an area to just test out if a slightly firmer grip pressure in that region, in that area, could actually stabilize the club face.
Oh, it absolutely does, particularly if and it's even more important to have equal pressure in short putts. For me, it's 7 feet and in. I used to say 6 feet because the green speeds have gotten so fast the last decade. I bumped it up a foot, but the idea is, yeah, you want to have very firm pressure overall, more like 70% of maximum or 60,
Really?
two-thirds of maximum. You want to want to make sure you have equal pressure. The only exception would be on the equal pressure in putting. I had a conversation years ago with Nicholas about this, and he agreed in general with my idea that I got from Hogan about the equal pressure. But he said, Jim, I disagree with you on very long putts outside roughly 35, 40 feet. He said, I feel like on those putts, I deliberately lighten my right hand pressure because I can feel the weight on the end of the stick better. And if you're right hand dominant, which he is, you can get more sensory feedback from your right hand to your brain with slightly lighter pressure on long. So I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
But I think on medium putts and for certainly on short putts, it should be equal. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. But it does just reinforce developing specific skills for specific areas of the game.
that's right.
And what we also touched on there, Jim, with the target with the focal points and relating it to Hogan, that you've said to me in the past that Hogan primarily played with a target focus.
Yeah, yeah.
But again, I think it's a really under explored area. When you pick a target, what is that target? Is it all the books tended to say, train it and trust it, pick a smallest possible target, aim at the bullseye and you won't miss the board. My experience is that small targets, Jim, for an awful lot of people can be really, really destructive.
100% agree. I don't do them anymore, but from 1995 to 2014, I think, I did a 1-day class, which was often before our 3-day class on ball striking, which was called Great Shot, Mastering the Craft of Ball Striking. But this 1-day class, which is always on a Thursday, was called Rip It to the Target. Now, of course, the premise of that is when you can focus on a target of any size, from small to big, I think that is, in some sense, a rock solid fundamental of the sport, of not just of our sport, of any sport. But it begs the question, well, how exactly do you do that? And my theory is two things: is you have to experiment to find out how your emotional side of your psyche reacts to a small target versus a big target. And about half of my mid to high handicaps, if they focus on a tiny target, it triggers an emotional reaction, i.e. a stress response.
Mm,
And they which weakens the mind-body connection. They
yeah.
flinch or just put a bad swing on it,
Mm,
right? But when they go to a bigger target, it frees them up.
mm,
And I had a conversation back on the driving range at the Citrus Club with Lee Trevino back in 1997, I think, about this. And he told me, he said, especially under pressure on a weekend on tour, he said, when I make my targets slightly or even moderately larger, I played better,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But like you said, there's this idea that tiny targets is the only way to go. It's just not true. I mean,
Yeah.
you have to. This is why you have to experiment to find out what works for you.
Yeah. Yeah. I've found it really valuable for even tour players. I can think of a couple in particular who'd grown up with the mantra of picking small targets and were struggling. And when we opened up the idea of hitting the ball into a channel, creating a wide channel into the green, and they started to see this huge channel feeding into the green. It
Yeah.
just completely changed. It completely I think one guy in particular, it totally freed him up, and he actually
Yep.
won a couple of times as a result of that. And he said it's just to Lee Trevino's point, to your point about Lee Trevino, it's getting away from these established cultural norms, isn't it? And questioning
Mhm.
some of these things that we've been told forever,
Yeah.
and coming back to, is this true for me? Does this actually relate to me? And is it actually beneficial to pick small targets? If small targets work, great. But if they don't, well, let's explore some alternatives.
I have a great story about this. In that school I mentioned, Rip It to the Target, we were doing target focus for about 2 hours. And one guy was hitting the best shots of his life, and he couldn't believe it. He was picking a very tiny target, basically the flagstick, hitting 8 irons to it, and one after another, just perfect. He was so excited. The guy next to him was hitting it worse and worse. And I finally talked to the guy who was hitting it worse. I go, "Well, what's going on? Are you sure you're focusing on the flag?" He goes, "Yeah, I'm positive." I said, hit a shot for me." Shanks it. I go, "Where was your mind?" He goes, "It was on the flag." I go, "Hit another one." Shanks it again. I go, "Well, what's going on? What is there something else going on besides just picturing the flag in your internal visual channel?" Because of course, on day one, we did exercises on the 3 sensory channel, so all the students were familiar with how that worked. He goes, "Yeah, I'm definitely in my internal visual channel. I'm picturing that yellow flag out there. But the problem is the flag's talking back to me." I go, "What are you talking about? The flag's talking back?" He goes, "The flag's basically saying to me, 'Nani, nani, nani, you can't hit me,' like a 3-year-old."
Got an
That's like,
aggressive flag.
it just blew my mind because I've always used small targets. And for me, small targets generally work really good.
Yeah.
But for him, it was just the opposite. I said, "Well, why don't you just pick, imagine, like you said, I said, imagine there's like like white lines like you'd have like in a like a football pitch on the driving range. And let's say they're like 20 yards wide, the
Yeah.
distance between the two white lines. And instantly he starts peppering the flag
Mm.
by simply making his target picture
Right.
bigger.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think these are the important threads that you can pick up, and maybe, well, definitely use a journal to sort of research your experience and sort of home in, because it could be that small targets work for one part of the game, and bigger targets work for another.
Well, there's actually a funny thing that you can find it online now. It's been kind of popular on Instagram apparently lately. Students have been sending me videos. You know, there's those series of tailor-made sponsored videos with Tiger and Rory and Jason Day and a few others. And one from like, I think from 7 years ago says, Tiger says, "I pick a very small, tiny landing spot for my for my chips and pitches," right? I'm thinking, "Oh, that makes sense. That's kind of what I do. I've got a very good short game." And then one from 2 years ago says, "Oh, I never pick a target. I just pick a big general area I want to pull." Like completely opposite from the same player, the
Really?
greatest player ever lived, was obviously using opposite strategies. Now we didn't go into depth. No one at the time said, "Well, wait a minute, you said the opposite 7 years ago." But it would be interesting to have that conversation with Tiger to see how he would explain
Wow.
that.
Yeah.
You know?
And I suppose drilling really deep, if you're a tournament player or somebody who's really at the sort of serious end of the game, again, it might be, and this is getting sort of really deep into it, that it might be that you have in your toolkit, that when the heat's really on, that maybe the targets do change.
Yeah, there you go.
I
Well, that's
remember,
pretty much what said to me. He said when he was under pressure, he made his targets bigger because he
yeah,
said he might use a small target on Thursday and Friday to make the cut, but on Saturday and Sunday, he would shift to a bigger target because he found it calmed him down emotionally, because again, when you see the target as a threat as opposed to a challenge to your physical skills, that triggers the amygdala gets triggered because that's a threat. That flag is a threat, which then triggers the fight or flight or freeze response, and the freeze is a flinch,
yeah,
and a flinch is what we call it in our sport. But a flinch is just a low intensity yip. That's all it is.
yeah,
And a
yeah,
yip is a high intensity flinch. So to me, the whole point of the mental game is how can you learn some mental game fundamentals to prevent you from flinching, basically. Yeah.
and at its base level, can you learn some mental game skills to reduce the perception of threat?
There you go. That's right.
Because it is ultimately a perception, because there is no threat in real terms, but our
No.
brain is literally seeing this as a caveman would do, as life or death. If your brain's perceiving that a small target is going to result in poor shots, and that's a massive dent to your ego. That is literally the brain is seeing an opportunity to die. As crazy as that sounds, isn't it?
And that gets back to our last podcast on rite of passage. This is something I've been banging this drum for 30 years, which is that, again, it's not that traditional protocols and drills and exercises from modern sports psychology or even psychoanalysis or cognitive behavioral therapy, so-called modern psychotherapy, don't work. They do work, but they don't work that well with someone who has a strong tendency to be easily triggered by threats.
Yeah.
They just don't.
No.
So to me, the fundamental mental game question is, how can we as golfers learn to achieve a sense of personal identity that is basically bulletproof in terms of the normal sort of psychological dynamic called success versus failure, right?
Right.
How can we better learn how to get to that sense of unshakable, rock solid confidence in our self-worth, so we don't have to prove it to the
Yeah.
world or to ourselves?
Yeah.
Then that can open up a whole other way of playing golf. Basically, that opens up the game called fearless golf. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I don't know whether we've mentioned it previously. I'm sure I've certainly mentioned it. I remember back in the 80s when Chuck Hogan wrote a load of books and videos and all the rest of it. And he always kept talking about playing golf from a safe place, which is what you're talking about there, isn't it? Playing
Yeah.
the game from a place where you're not, your overall sense of value as a person isn't on the line, determined
That's
by
right.
what a golf ball does. And if we don't, I think, is it too big a stretch to say, Jim? And this is, I suppose, the frustration that more people are not willing to look at the mental game and do something about it. Unless you actually understand these things and you maybe find that safe place and you understand what's going on with your brain, you're never ever going to reach your full potential, are you? You're never
No.
actually going to release your full capabilities.
It would be impossible. You need to go through some type of psychological, or even in the case of Vision Quest rite of passage, a spiritual transformation, if you really are serious about digging down into the really foundational roots of the mental game. There's another great story about this, which I always bring up with, particularly with my YIP students, talking about this issue, how to separate your self-worth, your identity from performance, from shot outcome. And I ask people, a lot of the younger generation don't really know much about the great boxer Muhammad Ali, but when Muhammad Ali first got into boxing, he got involved in a federally funded inner city youth program. There was a basketball option, there was a boxing option. He picked boxing, and his coach eventually became his number one sort of life mentor. I forget the guy's name, but he became basically a surrogate father to Muhammad Ali. At that time, he was growing up in Louisville, Kentucky. Both parents were working. Grew up in a poor neighborhood, ghetto. So there's this white guy was the coach for this boxing program. And in interviews I've read with the coach, he said, I realized the first time I saw the young, at that time before he converted to Islam, his name was Cassius Clay. I saw the young Cassius in the ring and realized I saw the most physically gifted fighter I'd ever seen. But he had a terrible mental approach.
Really?
He would get incredibly upset if he lost the match, lost the fight, like just overwhelmingly freaked out. And so he said to him, he said to the young Cassius, you need to learn to develop such a strong belief in yourself that your belief, your sense of self-worth is innate. It's because you're alive on the planet. You don't need to prove to yourself or to other people that you're a good person. You are a good person. You need to learn how to love yourself unconditionally. Now, there's an interesting backstory, which is, eventually he kind of got famous. It was almost thought to be almost like a psychological joke he would play at his opponents, but he would always say, I'm the greatest, right? His autobiography was called I'm the Greatest, or The Greatest.
Yeah.
And then there was a movie made, an autobiographical film with Will Smith playing Muhammad Ali. And and there's a theme song that the great Whitney Houston sang. I don't know about in the UK, but it was a #1 record here for about 3 months, called The Greatest Love of All.
Yes.
So I bring this up with students, and I say, during that song, most people have. I go, what's the lyrics about? oh, it's about romantic love. I go, no, apparently you're not really paying attention to the lyrics. It's nothing to do with romance. It's about loving yourself unconditionally.
Hmm.
That's the number one secret to sports performance. When you can keep your self-esteem completely separate from success and failure and realize you're a good person in your fundamental being and you don't have to prove your self-worth to anybody. That's what the song's about.
And I think also, again, deep topics these, Jim, but I think understanding the difference between self-love and narcissism, whereby narcissism actually is a full self-love, isn't it? Because it's
Correct.
still all about your reflection in the eyes of others for a narcissist.
That's exactly right. The narcissist is more perceives himself, him or herself through the eyes of other people, which is like the worst thing, one of the worst things you can do psychologically. From a Buddhist perspective, uh, I think they take it to the ultimate sort of conclusion. The idea is any psychological self-image you have of yourself is fundamentally an illusion, like an optical illusion.
Huh.
It's a psychological illusion, right? So you're not your self-image. You're so that begs the question, well, then what are you? Well, I guess traditionally you would use the word spirit or soul or higher self. I mean, there's number of different ways to call it, but it basically it's the idea that you come from another dimension, you manifest at birth in this body, you're here for
Yeah.
a while, and then you leave when you die. You go back to the original dimension. That's a common belief of every culture that's ever existed in the 300,000 years humans have been on this planet.
Yeah.
Therefore, you can't prove it scientifically to be true or not. It's impossible based on scientific principles to prove it or disprove it.
Yeah.
But it is a commonly held, universally held belief. Yeah.
Mm, mm, yeah. Which then that gives a safe place to play from, doesn't it? That gives a safe place that there is. We've touched on it with Scheffler and about faith and faith in something bigger or grander or wiser than us. Maybe that I'm not saying about religion, right or wrong, whether you are or you're not. It doesn't matter. It's just these explorations that he appears to be playing from an incredibly safe and free place to just go out and express his capabilities, and whatever
Yeah.
happens at a very deep level is going to be okay. And I think again, it's for people really understanding that we can never ever take off the table the range of potential options in terms of in terms of outcomes. That anybody has a range of outcomes, probably 20 shots on any given day. I think it's only when you're at peace with that, paradoxically, does that range of options actually narrow down somewhat.
100%. Yeah. Isn't that interesting? It's another paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Chuck Hogan would love to see Scotty Scheffler play
Mm.
because he's the epitome of playing from the safe place.
Yeah.
I mean, he can just, I mean, it's not that he hasn't been playing that great the last few tournaments, but, I've seen him badly miss hit a couple shots, but, he gets a little pissed, but not terrible. I mean, he
Yeah.
kind of just lets it go and keeps on doing his thing and focuses on his process, not the outcome. And
Yeah. Yeah.
right, I mean, process versus outcome is sort of I think that should be an ethic you apply to life off the golf course too, right? Not just on the golf course.
And it's not only because all these things can appear cliches, but they're cliches for a reason because they have validity. I think genuinely loving the process of developing skills and genuinely realizing, I think again we've talked about this, but this ultimate illusion or delusion that I'll be happy when I break 100, win the club championship, get on tour, win a major, fill in the blanks of whatever that is. It's realizing that actually the real prize which golf can give you is to just falling in love with the process of getting better. And as cliched as that sounds, I mean, Hogan talked about that. Back to Hogan. Hogan talked about he couldn't wait to get up in the morning to
That's
just go
right.
out and explore getting better again.
There's a movie that most film critics, even today, most of the time in their top 100 lists, it's the number one ranked movie, Citizen Kane by the great Orson Welles.
Yes.
That's the whole point of the movie is I'll be happy when is bullshit. Because at the end of its life, it was based on William Randolph Hearst, the right-wing media newspaper conglomerate, the tycoon in the States. That was the basis of the movie. And it was about this guy that had built incredible wealth from growing up in a poor farm family in Iowa where he was happy. And then I think, if I remember right, something happens when he's a kid. Either his parents die or something happens, but he ends up having to live with either strangers or unrelated family, people he wasn't close to. So he had a traumatic experience as a kid, and all he wanted to do was slide down the neighborhood hill in the winter on his sled, which he called Rosebud.
Rosebud.
So the whole movie starts like that, and then it goes through this whole process of him acquiring all this wealth. Like he was one of the wealthiest people on the planet, and fame, and various relationships with women, and this whole incredible arc of his life. Never happy.
Right.
I'll be happy when. He wanted more and more and more, and he never got enough. Because if you have a hole in your soul, you can't fill it with material things like money or status, right? You have to find some other way to fix the hole in your soul. So, of course, at the end of the movie, I hate to give a spoiler alert to people who haven't seen it, he's dying. And his dying words were Rosebud. And he goes back in time when he was a little kid, when he was happy just riding a sleigh down the hill.
Right.
Pretty cool.
I'm embarrassed to say, Jim, I've never watched Citizen Kane. I've obviously heard
Oh,
so
you
many
should.
people say it's the best
It's
film of all
really,
time, but I've never actually
yeah.
watched it.
Particularly the camera work. It was one of the earliest instances of a lot of what we call today long tracking shots. Not like we have with the Steadicam cameras today. Like, in fact, I was just watching Goodfellas right before we got on today, which has the most famous tracking shot in cinema history. I think it lasts for like 10 minutes, where Ray Liotta and his girlfriend are parking their car in an alley, and they go to a back door of a restaurant with this 60s soundtrack playing. And it literally takes, I think it takes 12 minutes before they get down to their table. But there were many versions of that which had never been seen before in cinema history.
Right.
In Citizen Kane. It's really well done.
It's interesting you mentioned Rosebud, though. That triggers a memory from another one of our mutual loves, Columbo. That was a particular
Oh, of
episode
course.
in Columbo with the dogs, wasn't it, with Rosebud?
Tell me, I don't remember that one. No, seriously, really.
Oh yeah, there was an episode and we are going off track here. There was an episode in one of the Columbo things where a guy committed a murder by actually getting two dogs to attack somebody, and the trigger word was Rosebud, and that obviously
Oh, interesting.
that must have come
Must
from
have been a reference to Citizen Kane. Yeah.
Citizen Kane.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Should we do we got enough time to do a little Hogan or no? What do you think?
Yeah, let's do a little bit more on Hogan. So, what was some of the other things that you mentioned about Hogan that was worth considering?
I think one of the things it's kind of a pet peeve lately because all we're hearing now is tensile force. So for the listeners, there's two types of forces in the human body relative to the ground. There's shear forces, which are horizontal, parallel to the ground, more or less forces, which is basically rotational in your pivot. And there's tensile or vertical forces, which are in the vertical dimension. And because in the modern era, when the long drive tour started, you see radically different swings up until recently. There was a big difference between how most PGA Tour pros swung the club versus long drive champions.
Yeah.
So all the long drive guys are up on their toes.
Yeah.
Both toes at impact.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it does produce, there's no question that absolutely produces more club head speed.
Yeah.
And it got to be a thing once Tiger got on tour because he had a little bit of that, not a lot, but he had some. Justin Thomas does it. There's a few others. But it's being taught now, particularly on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube, as something that average golfers should do. And if you're listening, if you're an average golfer, don't do that. You'll hit it worse because you'll have trouble finding the middle of the face. Hogan would puke if he saw that being an instructional advice today.
Really?
Hogan was about staying down, having connection, feeling like you're not up on your toes, but almost like your whole bottom of your foot is still touching the ground during the strike.
Right.
And he gave a free tip. We may have talked about this on one of our earlier podcasts, but I'll bring it up again. He met a wealthy oil tycoon in the airport bar at the Dallas-Fort Worth airport back in the 80s. And the guy said, I'll write you a check right now for $20,000 if you share me your secret. Now, of course, for the listeners, he didn't have one secret.
No.
He had many.
A bunch.
Right. But he said to the guy, get into the halfway down position. For the people who are familiar with the Mac O'Grady Ps, it would be P6. So your hands are basically just about hip height on the downswing, club shaft parallel to the ground. He said, you want to move your right heel toward the golf ball. So your heel is swiveling inward, which is called right foot aversion. That's the anatomical description of it, right? You don't want to go the other way and swing back where your heel moves away from the ball or away from the target up on your toe until well after impact.
Yeah.
So you want to stay grounded, close to the ground. He told, I think it might have been Gardner Dickinson, one of his students that he mentored, fellow tour pro. He said, when I'm hitting at my best, I feel like this is back in the era of steel spikes, I feel like my spikes grow 12 inches long during the strike. Meaning he wanted to feel rooted to the ground.
Really
Why did he want
grounded.
that? Yeah, really grounded. Why? Because his number one thing was to swing and balance. And if you're jumping up off the ground, you're going to be off balance instantly.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
So that's a big one
So
for sure.
the message you're saying there is that if you're working on the forces and jumping up and all the rest, that you may hit it further, but potentially
At what cost?
really
Yeah.
compromising your accuracy.
Yeah, yeah. He would. I think if Hogan was alive today, he would be very depressed about the modern state of the game, particularly the professional game. It's become kind of a long drive contest and a putting contest, and the rest of the game is kind of going by the wayside. Particularly the long approach shots with long irons. You don't see that anymore.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Gets back to the whole idea of rolling the ball back, like Nicklaus has been saying for the last 50 years.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Maybe-
At least for tour pros.
Well, maybe we'll talk about that on the next our next conversation, Jim, which I'm sure we'll line up.
Sure.
But fascinating as ever. Some great stuff there from ranging all the way around to Awesome Well, Citizen Cave, Peter Falk, Colombo, Ben Hogan. We've covered many areas, but I think summarising there, I think that coming back to that exploration for an individual of where your attention is and finding out where your attention needs to be.
Yep.
To actually release your capabilities.
So important.
Just mention it again, Jim, about people contacting you and where they can find out all the great stuff that you do.
My website is balancepointgolf.com. That's the easiest way. Yeah.
As ever, Jim, thanks very much.
Thanks, man. Take care.
Mind Caddy.